am back with Halley Sutton this week. Woohoo!
So happy to be back with you, Kate. Sorry, I interrupted you. Oh, no, God.
You're okay. I'm just glad I'm using the correct mic because on my last episode with you, I realized it was going through my camera. And I'm like, how did she even hear me?
Oh, you were great. It was great. I know. Yeah. I'm always... half the time I forget to grab headphones when I'm the worst at having stuff around when I need it.
Yeah. Well, as a podcast producer sitting with a mic in front of me and then the audio not being good, I was like, oh my God.
Oh no.
This is like my number one job. But we're back with a good mic for me at least. But I saw a TikTok here recently that I'm going to play for people. And I was like, that would be a fun podcast topic. And I feel like Halley would have some good thoughts about it.
I'm flattered.
So here it is. I'll probably...
Women read more fiction than men, and by reading fiction, many studies have shown that it makes you a more empathetic person. So within fiction, what are the genres that are really driving this increase in empathy? And I found this study that was done by NYU that actually specifically it is people who read romance and suspense/thriller that see this increased level of empathy.
Really?
So yeah. Wow. Oh, well, I'm reading ACOTAR. Good for me. Like, that's helping me. And I think they were being cute and funny about it, but that's, like, actually true.
That's so funny. The top liked comment, I think it has, like, 5,000-6,000 likes on it or something, is, like, me to my husband as I'm reading Ice Planet Barbarian. Yeah. I am better than you. That is so funny, but, like, also, yes, you are.
Yes, it's actually true. So the study, like, many studies have shown fiction increases your empathy, but they actually surveyed people by genre and then also gave people an interpersonal sensitivity survey. And after they controlled for personality, gender, age, English fluency, exposure to nonfiction, only the romance and the suspense/thriller genres remained significant predictors of interpersonal sensitivity, aka empathy. So there you go.
Wow.
Amazing.
So, I thought that would be really fun to talk about because I always think it's cool to talk about how you can become more empathetic through reading. And now NYU has a study proving it.
Totally. So what are some of your first thoughts about it? I'm curious to hear what your thoughts were on the video.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think literally, because she also says like fiction in general also raise levels of empathy too. And I think the reason that can happen so much is in most books, even if it's in third person, you're spending time in someone else's head for like a really long time. And so you're literally living someone else's life and like having experiences that you yourself wouldn't or just don't have. So like bare bones, that's where it's always like made sense to me that like spending that much time, like 8 to 10 hours in a character's mind is probably going to give you some empathy for some different situations.
Totally. I think that's like spot on. That's what I was thinking too, is, you know, how much books, and I'm sure there are studies on other mediums, so I don't want to like say this like I know it for sure, but books force you to engage emotionally and sort of like imaginatively in a way that a lot of other mediums don't. Like I think movies can provide a very cathartic, emotional, empathetic experience, but like you're seeing a picture somebody else has arranged for you. With books, you're having to like do that work yourself. And I think there must be something about the being in somebody else's brain and then having to engage your own sense of like, because you're an avatar of it, really, right? Like you're reading something and reading what the character is experiencing, and it starts to blur the walls between what the character is experiencing and what I'm experiencing. And I think that must be really the secret sauce between like increasing empathy there. And something else, and so they talked about that study, and something else that just came to me as they were mentioning is they talked about they controlled for gender, they controlled for all these other things, but they also talk about so the genres that do it the most are romance and thriller and like suspense. And I'm curious about your thoughts about why, because I have some thoughts about why. Yeah. But it also strikes me that those are genres that are also very heavily dominated by women readers. And I know that that's not exclusively true, but I'm curious about if that has any effect at all. And in fact, that women read a lot more fiction in general than men do.
Yep. Yeah, I wondered about that too. So yeah, and the other thing I think is interesting to your point is I think romance and thrillers are also the ones that like get looked down on.
Yeah, I know,
Like,
right?
in snob, if you're in a snobby reading circle, it's like,
Yep.
oh, you don't read literary fiction, you read thrillers and romance. Like,
I know. And I actually think there's something like really wonderful about the idea that they weren't like, it's literary fiction, you know? It's not
Yeah.
like, go read, you know, Jonathan Friends and then you'll have more empathy. It's like, get yourself to ACOTAR and like
Yes.
develop your sensibilities as a person, for sure. And so
Yeah.
I'm with you. I think that and I also think like something like, I do think part of that is tied in. I'm not trying to be gender essentialist here, but I do think part of that is tied in of like romance and thrillers being like genres that are heavily dominated by women writers and women readers. And that being part of the reason they're sort of looked down on. But it's also curious to see that they are such effective modes for building empathy.
Yeah. I feel like with thrillers, heightened emotions is kind of a part of it. Like if you're really calling it a thriller or suspense, like that means there's a big feeling that you're feeling all the way through. So I feel like that is part of it. And then also like thrillers can really, and non-thrillers can too, but thrillers really follow the hero's journey in some cases. So then you're experiencing like all this tension and how this person like goes through and figures it out. So I wonder if it's also just kind of like sticks in your head differently since it's emotionally charged.
I think you're right. And I think that's actually probably true about both of those genres, right? Like romance, you're getting a very different emotional charge, but like you're getting it is often a very like emotional charge or very, it pulls at you in a certain way. And then thriller, like you said, you're also in a heightened emotional state of like anxiety and different things. And it's interesting that horror wouldn't necessarily make that genre, but I think that there's something, it makes me wonder, and I don't think the study went this in depth. And so obviously Kate and I are going to have to do our own research investigation on this to like really get in there. But I'm curious too about like, you know, there's so many studies about why women read crime novels, why women read thrillers, why women read things in which they are often primarily the victims, and it's this interesting thing. Again, I feel like I'm wading into gender essentialist terms. I'm not trying to do that. Like I know plenty of men read crime fiction and thrillers, but there's been so many think pieces over like the last decade about like why women in particular are drawn to this genre. And I wonder and there's, you know, thoughts about it's like you get to experience some of the like fears you might have about being victimized in different ways played out, but in a very safe way. But I wonder if that too might also be the mechanism for some of that empathy building is sort of like seeing represented in a very safe fictional way, traumatic experiences that might build your capacity to understand or empathize with those, in the real world too, you know, that you're kind of like living through that or seeing somebody else live through that in a way that like the news doesn't quite make it as personal as a book would, you know?
Yes. Yeah. That also reminds me of, adjacent to that is like why representation in stories matter. So like that was one of the things I was thinking about with empathy too, is like, especially when it comes to like different experiences because of your race, like is such a wide experience, range of experiences. And so when you're able to like read from something that's like very rooted in like a culture that isn't necessarily your culture, then you get empathy for like those things too.
I had that thought too. And it also made me think of, again, I don't know, it seems to me like romance, perhaps more than other genres, has been having a really good burst of inclusivity the last couple of years, where we're seeing more romances that are from the perspective of different people of color. We're seeing like neurodivergent romances. We're seeing like body diversity romances. Like I feel like in a way, romance is the genre that has like which, you know, comes from a background of being like extremely white and extremely hetero, but like has started to open its doors more and more. And so thinking about that in terms of empathy too, I think you're totally right. And I'm wondering if that's part of it as well, as this sort of like more inclusive space. Not to say that the work is done or that romance as a genre is doing it perfectly, but I feel like I'm seeing more and more of that in romance than traditionally. And I think that's great.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I just don't read much romance, and sometimes I even feel bad ever saying it because I'm not even because some people do act like, oh, who reads romance? I'm just like, no, it just doesn't click in my head the way thrillers do.
I get it,
but like thrillers do sometimes. I think because they're pushing the boundary, action wise or that kind of wise. Sometimes they're a little more inclusive than other.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I think that there has been like a really good and strong, and there needs to be more of it, of a movement towards like more inclusivity in the thriller genres for sure. And I think that with that, you only see like increased empathy and like different things. Yeah. I also think it makes me think of, this is going to be, I'm wading into waters that I haven't fully thought through, but it makes me think of like part of the reason that a lot of us read The Diary of Anne Frank in school was because there's a way that like reading an individual story helps you unlock something really big and universal. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like I hope we can all agree, listeners, that like the Holocaust was awful and real and like, but as a concept, it's this big concept. But when you read it like The Diary of Anne Frank and reading one person's experience, it makes it personal and like comprehensible to you on a level that I think it doesn't reading about like the mass experience, even though what you're looking at is like mass suffering and trauma. I think it's like the getting to the individual stories about it are like the way to make people really kind of be able to unlock it in their brain and like wrestle with like the horribleness. You know what I mean?
I do. And it's crazy that you kind of said this, the way this lines up. It's really perfect timing that you said that, because I'm going to be interviewing Marjan Kamali for her book, The Lion Women of Tehran.
Amazing.
And it's a hilarious story how we got connected. I'll tell you later. But in the press kit that they sent over of like things she could talk about, she said this quote inspires her when she writes historical fiction. So her writing professor, E.L. Doctorow, said the historian will tell you what happened. The novelist will tell you what it felt like. And I feel like that's exactly what you just said about like versus like seeing things on the mass level versus like her book. You like feel what it was like to like have rights as a woman and then just like one day they disappeared.
Totally. And like, and that's such an empathy. Like, I think that that's something that we like, maybe without being consciously aware of it. I think that that's often why people read fiction, right? Is to like experience all these different lives and realities that are not the one that you're living in. And that like just naturally inside of that has to come this growth of empathy and like understanding. I mean, as long as you're like, you know, physiologically capable of like expanding your empathetic range, which most of us are, totally. But like, I totally agree with that. I think that's like, right. You know?
Yeah. I was thinking about it the whole time I was reading the book. 'Cause it's heavy and it's harrowing and it's so emotional. But then at the same time, I'm like, this is like what people lived through.
Totally.
Like, I just kept like thousands of women were feeling this way, basically.
Crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. But it is cool. I like sometimes, actually one of my picks is like that sometimes too, when it's like a book includes even not just a culture, but maybe like a community, unique community of people. It's like fun to kind of learn about that type of community through a story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. And like, this branches off into something that I was going to maybe bring up a little bit later, but like, as I've told you, don't know when this episode will air, but as of recording, I'm about a week and a half out from going to Egypt, which is like a life dream of mine, and I'm really excited.
So cool.
And I'm taking packing very seriously, as I always do on trips. But one of the things that I'm taking very seriously is like, what books am I going to bring? Like, I want to try to maybe bring some books that are like about Egypt or set in Egypt, so that I can have that experience of reading those there. But also it just is sort of like this way of like curating for myself, like what like readerly emotional experience do I want to have alongside this like crazy life experience? And so I'm like playing, basically I have like a March Madness basketball bracket in my room of like 25 books I have on the floor being like, now which of you gets to go, you know?
Oh my gosh. That's hilarious. That would be funny if you like took pictures at like each stage that you like narrow it down.
Honestly, I think I've been pretty absent on TikTok, but I was thinking that might be a fun TikTok series to be like round one of which books go to Egypt.
Yes. That would be fun. I would watch.
Okay.
But yeah, you can kind of pair your book experience with your physical one.
Totally, which maybe doesn't speak necessarily to empathy, except to be like, as you pointed out, the idea of sort of like using stories to facilitate better understanding of like a culture or a place or like a moment in time, I think is like, that's like the basis of like all literature and film. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, do you have some books that inspired empathy in you?
I do. The first ones that came to mind, I'm pretty sure we talked about in a different episode, but truly the Dear America series of books when I was a kid was like, and they were all, you know, as I can see it like lighting up on your face, but for anyone unaware, they were kind of like fake diaries written from the perspective of a young woman in a certain moment in time. And sometimes they would be famous people. Like I remember they had a whole like royal series where it would be like Princess Elizabeth, who grows up to be Queen Elizabeth I. And like her diary is like a 12-year-old. Or the one that I was thinking of that really stuck with me was there was a young woman who was like a servant on the Titanic. And like, so they were just kind of these like really interesting historical fiction, but kind of like deep vehicles into what somebody's imagined life or world would have been like at that time. And I just remember having my like mind blown, because you'd be like, this girl was basically a mail order bride for like a steel worker in Pennsylvania in the 1800s. And she was on the Titanic, and somebody else was like colonial, and there was an enslaved person. And like, it was just all these different sort of like insights into young women who were the same age as me, but very different than me. And I found that to be like crazy effective for like broadening my understanding of people and experiences.
I loved those books so much.
They were so good.
I saw a reel of it or something recently and sent it to someone who I thought like for sure would have read them, and they were like, I don't know what these are. So now I need to find it and send it to you.
Yeah.
You remember with me.
Oh, please. I had like a bitchin' library of them at one point, because they all looked very similar. They were just like different colored like covers. And I just like, here we go. You know, that was bookshelf wealth when you were a kid.
Yes, it was. Oh my gosh. And what was the other? I feel like, at Nancy Drew, I had like all the yellow spines.
Totally. Those were great. Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. Well, mine is a little different, my first one, but in speaking about like learning more about a community, Hurt for Me by Heather Levy is like, I love the way she approached this book. So the book is basically about Ray Dixon, who is lucky to be alive. And 15 years ago, she survived being trafficked and abused, escaping her captors to reclaim her life. Now she's running a thriving business with her best friend, raising a teenage daughter on her own. Ray's finally in control, literally. As Mistress V, Ray is the one calling the shots, catering to Oklahoma City's elite in her private dungeon, which fronts as a spa. But when a client goes missing, Ray's world spins out of control. Detective Clearwater shows up at the spa, sparking panic when he asks questions that risk exposing Ray's true business. After several young women from her underground community disappear too, Ray spots a chillingly familiar pattern. Together, she and Detective Clearwater must find answers before more lives are destroyed, including those they love. And she just approaches the like BDSM community in such a like informative and empathetic and just like also neutral would be what I would also say, neutral way. And so you really can get to know more about the community by reading it, but it's also like a fantastically plotted thriller.
It so is. I'm so glad you mentioned that book. I mean, that book is so good. It's like all things. It's sexy, it's titillating, it's informative, it's about trauma, it's a great paced thriller. Like, Heather is so great. She was one of my Pitch Wars mentees, and she's just like a fabulous writer and like is so unafraid of tackling thorny topics like this. Like this could easily be something that people are, you know, are reluctant to pick up or might have judgment about. And she makes like the world so accessible and like fascinating and like it's so great. And she did that with her first book too, Walking Through Needles, which is basically like also the story about a young woman who went through some like really traumatic stuff in her childhood. But like Heather just kind of takes these unconventional angles at stuff, which I think is like such a great way when we're talking about empathy to be like, it's not, it feels very true to lived experiences and not necessarily like cultural perceptions of what these things might be, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And not like a shtick for the book.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Oh, great pick.
Thanks. I really loved that one.
I know. She's great. And okay, are you aware? So Hurt for Me, great title. She comes up with her book's title first. She like finds like title in her mind and then like ruminates on it and like eventually a story comes. And I was like, Heather, I didn't know that. I didn't even know that was an option. Like that's not how my brain works. Like, and she said that. I was on a book event with her and she said that and I was like, what? Like you're a marvel. You're just like extraordinary. What are you talking about?
That is so cool.
Isn't that cool? Yeah.
Good for her.
Yeah. And she has really great titles. I can't remember her one that's her next book, I think is called This Violent Heart or something like that. Violent. Yeah. And it's
about it on Facebook.
Another great title. I mean, truly, The Woman's a Machine.
She is. I love her hair.
I know. She's very cool.
Pink hair. She's seriously the coolest.
She is extremely cool. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
I have another pick. It's so funny. So we start this conversation talking about how thrillers and romance novels encourage empathy, but a lot of my picks are not those. But I read a
it's more through fiction, so we'll count it.
True.
Yeah.
So I read a book called Dear Dickhead this summer by Virginie Despentes. She's a French writer, and it's a French book in translation. And it's an epistolary novel told mostly between emails and blog posts between these kind of three central characters. There's a woman who's like an aging actress. There's a man who's a writer who knew the actress when she was young and was kind of like looked up to her and thought she was so sexy. And then there's a young woman who worked in publishing who has been just kind of terrorized by the male writer. And it's a fascinating book. I am a person who in general supports women's rights and women's wrongs, meaning like, you know, not a lot of empathy necessarily for the Me Tooters. But this book kind of managed to have a really interesting look at the way that humans can influence each other in all sorts of different directions, and was very empathetic in real ways to all of its characters, all of whom were flawed, some to various degrees, like, you know, the guy who kind of without giving too much away, so he basically believes that he's in love with this young woman and kind of doesn't necessarily physically assault her so much as emotionally and kind of verbally, and is like, won't take no for an answer. Why won't you date me? I'll kill myself if you don't date me. All this like really, truly horrific, traumatic stuff. But it kind of, the book is like about the way that all of these characters kind of influence and shape each other in these experiences going forward. And I came out of it just being like, what an interesting, complicated view of humanity that's, I would say, ultimately optimistic without leaving easy answers for anybody. It wasn't like it was like, oh, this guy is such a good guy, but it was like, what if people are capable of change? And which I think people are, but they have to really work at it. But like, what if people are capable? Yeah. And like, what if people are capable of change, and the way that we like influence and shape each other is a big part of that change. And like, it was just a book where I can't remember the last time I started a book and like deeply disliked and hated a character. And by the end, maybe didn't love him, but was like, my feelings had shifted so much, and it felt very real. Cool. And it was, and it was a interesting, complicated, nuanced, thorny book, and really glad I read it, and very worthwhile. Yeah, for sure. Right.
Yeah. That's really cool. Mm-hmm. I love that when the characters are that dynamic.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. Dynamic is the right word.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Bookwild. And if you are, could I ask you a favor? Could you go and rate and review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening? Ratings and reviews make the biggest difference in discoverability of the podcast, and I definitely want to find all of our fellow thriller readers out there. So if you could go rate the podcast and leave a short review, that would make a huge difference. Thank you, and let's get back to the show. That reminds me of one of mine, because it for similar reasons felt really empathetic for me. And it's Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Mm-hmm. Because like the gist of it is the book is told in like documentary form. So you're like reading the transcription from basically a documentary. But because it's done that way, you are kind of getting the like removed God view almost, where you're seeing the differences in some of their stories, even when they're telling the same story, or like the same moment is a little different from each of them. But the other thing it really deals with is kind of what you were talking about. There's some characters where you're like, man, he is not a good guy, and then you're like, yeah, but he kind of is,
right?
And like then everything gets really complicated with everyone's relationship, all seven of them. And so kind of what you were saying, so much of their experiences together end up like shaping their lives in different ways. And then I wish I could kind of venture into spoiler the territory, but the ending just has like such cool nuance, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's like a whole other level of like, you like love and respect this other character so much at the end. And it's just so complicated.
Totally. And I'm with you. I want to talk about the ending with you, but we'll have to do that offline. But like I was really pleasantly surprised by the ending, that it went in the direction it did, because it felt like a way to honor all of the characters without it. Yeah, it was really beautiful. And I totally agree. And I actually feel like Taylor Jenkins Reid, I think that's maybe part of the reason so many people connect with her stuff, is
I think so too.
The like empathy she has for these characters, the way that she creates characters who are complex and have many different, and like that in some way all of her stories are about diving more deeply into this person than you see at first glance. And I think that that's really cool. And like, I think that's why people respond to them so well.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I sobbed my way through the end of that book. That one and Evelyn Hugo took me out.
For sure. Both of those. And I cried at Carrie Soto too. I really liked Carrie Soto. I
sobbed. That one I cried even longer, I think.
It's so good. I think, I mean, obviously I have Challengers goggles on with anything now tennis related, but like for my money, I think Carrie Soto is her most like technically excellent book. Like the way that she wrote it is just so great.
It is.
Yeah. I have one that's kind of on that same theme, which is I really just like, I don't know, I guess part of my life the last couple of years has been like, how can I shoehorn this book into conversations? But I know you read it and enjoyed it, and I'm curious to talk more about it. The Force of Such Beauty by Barbara Borland, which is basically like, has a plot to it, but really is kind of, I would say, like a book that's a deep character study. Would you agree with that? Yeah. It just is like you dive really deeply into the skin of this person, who is somebody who's seen a lot and also has a lot of privilege, which I think can be a hard place to like empathize from, like as a reader to be like, okay, so you're the crown princess, you know, like rough life, but like she does it in such an interesting way and makes that character so fully human. I am somebody who at this point in time is more or less, you good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah. More or less like sort of neutral on Meghan Markle. I think she got a lot of racist press and treatment in the UK, and I'm sure in America too. And I'm also a little bit sort of like, okay, you guys need to sit down and take a back seat for a little bit, like just. But which is all of which is to say though, something about reading that book, even though it's not exactly the experience of Meghan Markle, really kind of was like, oh God, I could see all the downsides of having all this privilege and of kind of living in this fishbowl in this way, and the sort of like awfulness of all of that. So that was a book that really, I think, was great on that level for me too.
Yeah, and it does the empathy like that in the poor little rich girl. It empathizes into that, and like how trapped you are typically if you are a part of royalty or really probably any government. Like politicians' kids probably feel somewhat similar sometimes. Totally. But it also has like, because she was an Olympic athlete, which is like seems like such a random detail when you like read it, but she ran like all the time. Yes. And then has an injury, something related to her hip, I think. And the nature of it makes her body hurt kind of all the time for the rest of her life. Yeah. And so you also like feel her physical, you have a lot of empathy for people who live with pain long term is like the other thing that stood out to me.
Totally. That's a really good point too. I hadn't even thought about that aspect of it, but you're right. Like that she's like driven her body into perfection, but also like destroyed it at the same time and like lives with those consequences constantly. Yeah.
And it's just you just like how like being on a plane, she's like nervous to be on a plane because she can't stretch enough and her muscles just. I also put a lot of attention into my muscles, so like some of it too, I was just like, oh man, totally, I'm feeling this while I'm reading it.
Yeah, for sure.
It's very like it's a visceral read in a lot of ways.
It really is. Whatever sorcery Barbara Borland, like her prose just feels very alive to me. And I think that's part of it too, is like you really feel like you're with a real person. And I think that anytime a writer can do that, it expands your empathy. Just because like, as you were saying at the top of our talk, like you're in somebody's head for however long it is you're reading. It's how can you not start to take on their perspective?
Yeah. Well, my next one is The Push by Ashley Audrain.
Nice.
So also as someone who's never like, I am very aware that I could wake up 10 years from now and be like, I do want a baby. Sure. So I'm not saying that I can't change my mind, but from someone who hasn't really been interested in that at any point, this is like, this book will make you too scared to ever have kids.
Oh no.
Oh, you haven't read this. Okay.
I haven't, no.
Okay, so but the empathy of like motherhood and how terrifying it would be if your child had really bad behavioral issues, like that's like such a big part of the suspense. And so you have all this empathy for her as a mother and like the situation. So this one basically, Blythe is determined that she'll be the warm, comforting mother to her new baby, Violet, that she herself never had. But in the thick of motherhood's exhausting early days, Blythe becomes convinced that something is wrong with her daughter. She doesn't behave like most children do. Or is it all in Blythe's head? Her husband, Fox, says she's imagining things. The more Fox dismisses her fears, the more Blythe begins to question her own sanity. And the more we begin to question what Blythe is telling us about her life as well. Then their son, Sam, is born, and with him, Blythe has the blissful connection she'd always imagined with her child. Even Violet seems to love her little brother, but when life as they know it has changed in an instant, the devastating fallout forces Blythe to face the truth.
Bum, bum, bum.
It is so good, but like it is bleak and harrowing, but like she also does all this really fascinating stuff with like bouncing back to her mother, and then you're trying to be a better mother, and then but your kid like might be kind of sadistic. Like what do you do? So you just feel all the feelings all the way through this. And then I don't think it's it says her husband Fox says she's imagining things. So then you get the husband like gaslighting her, and you're just like, what's the truth?
Totally. And that, like, there's so many, it's so interesting because that's such a rich ground, and you see it in things, right? Like Rosemary's Baby is very, like, what do you do if the person you love is like gaslighting you about like your family, and like, especially as the mom where you're supposed to be like such an influence on your kids and you know them better, and then like all the weight that comes with like the things we put on motherhood, like the weight of it all, like I can't, that book may be too real for me that might be why I partially haven't picked it up.
I was gonna say, it is like, you're just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But her writing, I appreciate her writing so much. I interviewed her, I have the book back there, about The Whispers. And I like asked what drew her to writing about motherhood and thrillers. And I love that her answer is basically like, motherhood is terrifying. That's why.
Yeah, for sure it is. I don't have kids and I find it terrifying.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Yeah.
That's a good one.
So read at your own risk, but it's like an emotionally poignant masterpiece.
Totally. That's a good one. On the subject of motherhood and the terrifyingness of it, I would say one of the books that I would say increased empathy, but it's this book, but I guess it's also this kind of type of book. It's a book called Little Deaths by Emma Flint. And it is a retelling of a true story of a woman named, I'm just looking it up right now, I think her name is Alice Crimmins from the 1950s, who was convicted of murdering her 2 children, who basically go missing in the middle of the night and then wind up dead in this sort of like Brooklyn neighborhood. And she was, 1950s, and she's kind of a younger woman. She's attractive, and she's shown, putting kind of like an Amanda Knox type thing, where it's like her behavior after her children die, people deem to be inappropriate social behavior, which is to say like kind of crazy, because who amongst us knows how you would behave in like the face of some of the worst tragedy? You know what I mean? I just don't think it's necessarily fair to say like, you're not behaving the way that I think I would, and you're like, well, okay. So this book is kind of a retelling from her point of view of what may or may not have happened in her experiences. And I am just a big fan of books like that, or even movies like I, Tonya or something, which takes a figure that we think we know one true public story about and examines it from different angles, because of course we can't ever know what somebody's actual experience is like. And even reading that book, I don't know that that's what her experience was like, but just, I think opening the space to imagine that it may look different than the narrative that we've been told, I think is valuable, like empathetic work for fiction and film to do.
Yes, it is. 'Cause it's just like, kind of like there's 2 sides, and then there's the truth kind of stuff. Is like everything's gonna like the truth is gonna be some amalgamation of like what both people experienced.
Totally, truth is subjective. Not any of it at all. Right. Truth is subjective and ever moving, and who gets to say something can be true for me, but it doesn't mean it's true for the world, and like all these. And I think the like part of the beauty of the empathy that fiction can bestow is sort of like having to wrestle with those complexities in ways that like a lot of other things want to make it more narrow. And I think the wider we can make that conversation, it makes things messier, but it probably makes it more true to like life and empathy.
A little more fair too.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, my next one, I remember talking with Kelly Garrett about this too, but Missing White Woman is one. So like the opening scene is incredibly suspenseful, and it's because the main character is traveling to a town she hasn't been to before, and she's Black and entering an Airbnb late at night, and like feels like there's kind of a white woman behind her, like keeping an eye on her. So you get right into the first chapter of like just walking into an Airbnb is a different experience for a Black woman than it would be for me. And there's like suspense all just because of like her identity and who she is. So, and that carries through the book, where it's like, basically she goes on vacation with her boyfriend for just like a 3-night thing. And on the second night, basically she wakes up and her boyfriend's not there. And there's a dead white woman at the bottom of her stairs. And she's a woman who's been like highly publicized on TikTok, and like she's a missing white woman. So everyone is obsessed with who she is. And so it's not that the story's not about figuring out what happened to this woman, but a lot of the suspense is the fact that she's a Black woman in a city where she knows no one, and she's the only one in the house when this happened. And like, she needs to essentially clear her name because she doesn't feel like anyone is going to do it for her. So I feel like it's just such a good example for like anyone who doesn't live that. You're going to have like a whole other level of empathy for that experience being so much different.
Totally agree. And I love that Kelly, with that book, I mean, she's writing a great thriller, and she's also like tackling head on the whole missing white woman phenomenon. Like, you know, when you're talking, I'm remembering Gabby Petito and all these different people where it's like, it's not that I don't want white women to be publicized when they go missing, but you want all women, all people, when they go missing or experience violence, to get that same level of publicity is like what I think we should be striving for. And I love that she's kind of tackling head on the sort of like the true disparities of that like white women actually are like not as likely to be victimized as many other groups. And yet so many books, my own included, often deal with that, you know? And it's, I don't know. And I love that. Kelly is so great. Kelly is like such a great writer on so many levels. You know what I mean? Like she's playing 4-dimensional chess out there.
She is.
For sure.
It's great. I loved it. I also love when people include like social media, because it has such a big influence on stuff like that. So like she used TikTok in a really cool way in the book.
Totally. And like, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Social media has like become this thing for like missing people or like true crime where people want to get involved. And I think that is such an interesting double-edged sword of like, that can be good and that can also be bad, you know? And like, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That's what I talked with, Rachel McGuire on The Surface. That's their book really does it really well, where they're showing like how these like armchair detectives like get in the way. Like, but then in another book, you're like, oh, they're a vigilante and that's all good. So like, they're just on different levels.
Totally. Or there's like, you know, you hear about stories, and like this maybe even predates social media, but like where they publicize it and all of a sudden then the cops get like, which first of all, I'm not saying this, like I think the cops are, the solve rates for murders are frighteningly low in this country, especially depending on like which marginalized group you fall into. But like you'll see cases where something gets publicized and all of a sudden then they have like 5,000 tips they have to wade through. And like that whole time that they're like vetting that, the case is getting colder and colder because most of those are not going to be worth any, you know what I mean? And it becomes this interesting phenomenon of publicizing a case is often a best chance to help it get solved, and also can work against it in very specific, interesting ways too. Yeah.
It's catch-22.
Catch-22. So I have another one too, which is an interesting one. The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve Douay. Have you read it?
No, I know the cover, but no, I haven't read it.
It's great. And it's based on many real places that existed in the United States that I knew about, but I didn't know as much about the history until I read this book, and then I started looking into it. And Tanana Reeve Douay actually had an uncle who was sent to a reformatory, which was basically a place where young boys of color, specifically Black boys or white boys who maybe had behavioral issues. Like it was one of those places where it was like, theoretically it was a reform school. So you went there if you had behavioral issues, but a lot of things got shoved into what was a behavioral issue. Some of it might've just been like being Black in public, you know, or like different things where it's like, okay, that's really just like an excuse to use a vehicle as racism and like all these different things. And so they would go there And we have found out in the last like 10 or 15 years that there were like mass graves of boys who died there and were just like left and buried. And so this book, I was trying to think about how to frame this when I'm reading it, because I think when we talk about empathy, we're often talking about the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And I wouldn't say it's fair for me as a white woman to have read that book and be like, I now understand some more about racism, but it really was more about getting this deep look at a life that I don't live, and that like that it made more real to me than just reading a history book. Like we talked about some of these experiences, and like thinking how important it is to have books like The Reformatory out there, which first of all, it's just like a great ghost story and spooky and a thriller and wonderful, but also is like publicizing a corner of American history that I think we would often rather shove in a closet and not look at. And I don't think that's the right thing to do either. So that book, I think for me, is a book that's maybe empathy is the right word, or maybe it isn't, but just sort of expanding my knowledge and understanding of a piece of history and an experience that I don't have.
Yeah.
Your dog agrees.
She said it real good. No, I totally agree. That quote is going to stick with me forever. The idea of like the historian tells you what happens and then the novelist tells you how it felt.
Yeah.
It's just, and it dovetailed so well with empathy as a discussion.
Totally.
But it is, you do, when you're like in that person's brain for, again, like 8, 10, however many hours, you are experiencing it more than just understanding that bad things happened to a different race than you in the past.
Totally. It's like, it's animating it. It's walking around inside your skin in a different way. Yeah. And that's why I think it's like so important that we have more stories so that we can like do that more and more frequently, and then hopefully bring that back into our real lives.
Yeah. My next one actually really pairs well with that. But some of it I can't talk about why because of spoilers, but it's adjacent, and it's Did you hear about Kitty Karr? And if you've listened to this podcast for the last 3 years, you have heard about her.
You have in fact heard about Kitty Karr, yes.
I can't stop talking about her. But it's by Crystal Smith Paul, and it is about basically Elise St. John in the present. She's a celebrity. And she and her, I can't remember, or her other sisters, maybe I should just read this so I don't spoil it. When Kitty Karr Tate, a white icon of the silver screen, dies and bequeaths her multi-million-dollar estate to the St. John sisters, 3 young, wealthy Black women, it prompts questions, lots of questions. A celebrity in her own right, Elise St. John would rather focus on sorting out Kitty's affairs than deal with the press. But what she discovers in one of Kitty's journals rocks her world harder than any other brewing scandal could. And between a cheating fiancé and the fallout from a controversial social media post, there are plenty. The truth behind Kitty's ascent to stardom from her beginnings in the segregated South threatens to expose a web of unexpected family ties, debts owed, and debatable crimes that could, with one pull, unravel the all-American fabric of the St. John sisters and those closest to them. As Elise digs deeper into Kitty's past, she must also turn the lens upon herself, confronting the gifts and burdens of her own choices and the power that the secrets of the dead hold over the living. So this like spans multiple generations. You go back into, I don't know how far back you go now at this point, but you go, I feel like it's like the 40s, the 50s, I think. I don't know. But you're following the story of a Black woman at present and a Black woman in the past, and how some things come to converge. But it's another thing where like reading what it was like to be treated the way they were for so long, like you feel it differently when you read it through a story, and you're like, wow, like this is legit how someone had to exist, and like these were the sacrifices they had to make. And it really, when I read it, I also talked about how like it really explores like when you're from a minority group or a group that no one cares about or cares less about, like how hard it is to want more for yourself and to still like go out there and try to get it. Like I feel like you have even more empathy for how much harder it is to do that.
Totally. Beautifully said. And like we talked about earlier, the value of representation and being able to see yourself in other stories, and like even in fiction, I think that that's really important, you know? And to acknowledge too that like, due to like white supremacy, it feels like the default is like white characters, but like that isn't the default. That's just a perspective, right? Like, and the more perspectives we have, ideally, the more we're kind of like unpacking and unthreading that like, it's not that being white is the default position in America. It's just that's been like elevated, you know, as what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I have one more pick that also kind of speaks to that theme, which is called Say Hello to My Little Friend by Janine Capo-Crusette. And it is the story of a young man who was a refugee from Cuba with his mother, came on a raft when he was a kid, and he's like decided that his model for masculinity is going to be Scarface. And as he grows up, and which there's like so many levels to unpack there. And then it's also, there's a point of view from the oldest living whale in captivity down in Florida, like near where this guy is living. And so it just kind of like examines the cultural, societal, and like actual cages that people exist in. Like there's beautifully drawn parallels between this young man who's both comes from a marginalized group background and also like doesn't have a lot of like the role model he can look to for like how to be a man in his society is Scarface, which is like a terrible role model. Like that's not, and that the ways that you're kind of like written into these stories that aren't the stories you would choose to live, but others have sort of chosen for you, or that like there aren't enough stories to build something else. And you see it with him, you see it with the Lolita, the whale who's in captivity. I mean, it's like, it's a very interesting book. I haven't read anything like it in a long time, and it's funny and dark and heartbreaking. Like I got to a point where I didn't want to finish the book because I could see what was coming, and I was like, I don't want to live this. And yet it felt very important and beautiful to get there. And I don't know, it's a really, really well done, interesting, heartbreaking book.
Yeah. I do want to read that one.
It's good.
It feels like it would maybe scratch the part of me that liked Made for Love.
Yes.
In some ways. Just kind of
different. It has not quite as much of that quirkiness, but it does have some of it for sure. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, my final one, this is to keep it short, because I think I said this in an episode was a couple weeks, but is gonna, I don't know, some people may have heard this already chronologically, but to keep a really long story short, I last Monday went on to interview an author, like got logged into the studio, and another author's name popped up in it, and I was like, what? I've never had this happen before.
Oh no.
So I was expecting Emma Bamford, who I actually did end up connecting with her. And Marjan Kamali showed up in my studio, and I was like, well, I'll just accept it. I'm like reading the synopsis really quickly.
Yeah.
And so I told her, I was like, I have not read your book. I'm so sorry. I was expecting someone else. I've never had this happen. And I was like, so we could either just do an interview, because like I can talk to you about it, or I was just saying like, I can, if you want to go ahead, like since you're here. And she was like, I feel like your interview would be a lot better if you read my book. And I was like, it would be. And she was like, okay, so like, could you go ahead and read it? I'm like, yeah, let's do it. So that was like this fun kismet of like just meeting someone, and it just happened to be her publicist had multiple people's calendars and just put it on hers. And
got it.
Now we met.
Well, that's kind of amazing. And also, what a terrifying nightmare to be like, oh my God. As somebody who's like interviewed people before, I would just be like,
yeah. I'm like, I haven't read it. I haven't even read the synopsis.
Oh
no. And now it's been like so huge in the way that it even affected this conversation, because that quote about the novelist showing you how it makes you feel was so fascinating to me and stuck with me the whole time I was reading this book. And so I should probably just read the synopsis. So much happens. In 1950s Tehran, 7-year-old Ellie lives in grand comfort until the untimely death of her father, forcing Ellie and her mother to move to a tiny home downtown. Lonely and bearing the brunt of her mother's endless grievances, Ellie dreams of a friend to alleviate her isolation. Luckily, on the first day of school, she meets Homa, a kind, passionate girl with a brave, irrepressible spirit. Together, the two girls play games, learn to cook in the stone kitchen of Homa's warm home, wander through the colorful stalls of the Grand Bazaar, and share their ambitions for becoming lion women. But their happiness is disturbed when Ellie and her mother are afforded the opportunity to return to their previous bourgeois life. Now a popular student at the best girls' high school in Iran, Ellie's memories of Homa begin to fade. Years later, however, her sudden reappearance in Ellie's privileged world alters the course of both of their lives. Together, the two young women come of age and pursue their own goals for meaningful futures. But as the political turmoil in Iran builds to a breaking point, one earth-shattering betrayal will have enormous consequences. This book is like, you want to talk about empathy. I think it's why I was exhausted by the time I read it, because you just feel it for everyone in the story and what they're going through. And it, like, I'm just going to admit, I did not know that it was new that women lost their rights in Iran and Tehran.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't know that the 50s and 60s looked pretty similar to the rest of what was happening in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So even that was just like, talk about an empathetic experience, like imagining just losing your rights, like, because some religious fundamentalists take over.
Oh, you mean like what might be happening in America?
I was about to say it, and I was like, and honestly, it was a little creepy reading it right now.
Yeah.
I was like, oh no.
Like Project 2025 vibes. Okay.
Yeah, like if you don't have the kids, you don't get as many votes vibes. Like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yep, it was. That was part of it. I was like, oh no, this is like good to remember that it can just go away. Like we can't assume that it won't necessarily.
100%. And that book sounds amazing and I want to read it.
It's so good.
Yeah, I got to read it. But I'm with you. That's so terrifying and also like such a good reminder that like, yeah, we've taken some of these things for granted because like it's always been true in my lifetime that like women have had the right to vote in America, but that doesn't mean we should ever stop fighting for that.
Yeah. And Homa is one of my favorite characters ever. I deeply, deeply love how unapologetic she is and just like passionate and authentic. It's just she's a beautiful character.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely.
I cried a lot. I cried a lot in this one too.
That reminds me a little bit of. I have one more pick too, but and this isn't it, but maybe my first real brush with like the deep empathy that a story can teach you was when I was, I think, in second grade. We had like a traveling theater troupe come and performed the story of Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Are you familiar with this tearjerker?
No, I'm not.
Oh God. Okay. So I'm going to try to explain it and I may or may not cry. Like that's where we're at with this story for me. Yeah. So it's the story of, and it's based on a true story, which is the truly horrifying part of this little girl, Sadako, who survives the, United States bombing Japan using the nuclear bombs, but she survives it and she's, I don't know how old she is, maybe 8 or 9 in the thing, but goes on to find out that she has leukemia from the radiation of the blast. And the story is she finds out that there's this like tradition that if you make 1,000 paper cranes, oh no, you can ask for a wish and it can be granted. And she gets to like, her wish is that she's going to survive. And she gets to like 950 and dies. And I lost my shit. Devastated.
I would have.
And so it's like the community comes forward and finishes the cranes for her after she's died. And it's this beautiful story of like resilience and like the horror of this and all these different things. I got sent home from school because I could not stop crying the rest of the day. I remember my teacher, like, I just remember like doing a workshop sheet and I'm just like crying, not like hysterical, but like I'm doing the math worksheets, but just like tears, just like a spigot. Oh, yeah. And my teacher being like, honey, what's wrong? And I was like, Zanago and the cranes. And like, I remember too, she had to give this like little speech to our class and was like, some kids are more sensitive than others and we shouldn't tease them about it. So presumably somebody was making fun of me, but like eventually they just called my mom and they were like, she's a mess. You got to take her home.
Just take her home. Oh my God.
I was just the idea that you could like, I think it also was like, I think a lot of things happened there. I mean, it's objectively a sad story. And I don't think I was like, I was obviously not dealing with like the US ramifications of it at age 7 or 8 or whatever, but like, I think it was like the first time mortality was real to me, really, as a kid. And the idea that like she could have worked so hard and gotten so close and still doesn't achieve. I was like destroyed, emotionally destroyed, still tear up when I talk about it. That one really touched something deep inside.
That was Mufasa for me.
Oh God.
I was 2 years old and my parents someone took me, and like literally they had to take me out of the theater because I was just wailing, like just sobbing.
It's so traumatic. I mean, that he's hanging there terrible. And then Scar and then just the like slow-mo.
Same thing. You can get that close and you won't save like the most important person in your life.
Totally. Oh God, so brutal.
Yeah, Disney was rough on us. They weren't giving us Inside Out. They were giving us dead parents.
That's true. Disney was like, your parents will die anytime now. A stampede is coming. Like they were very, But I mean, and it's funny because you're right. Like Pixar now, like there's like stories and anecdotes about the way that Pixar is actually engineered to make you emotional, like the things that they do. But I agree. It's sort of different. It's sort of like more wholesome. I feel like when we were kids, Disney was like, we're going to murder your family. And then the story starts. And you were just like, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Bambi loses his mom. Simba loses his dad. I saw something that was like, Cinderella is enslaved. Like,
totally. For sure, at least like serf for, like what did they call it when it was like you had to be a servant for like 7 years or whatever? You know what I mean? Like for sure. Like it was, indentured servitude for sure. Yeah. And you're right. And like,
now they have really great story arcs that help you understand your feelings.
Totally. And like if you're emotional, it's like, it's the value of family or like tradition and like all this other stuff. It's not just like that thing we've taught you to love, dead now. But you can buy a stuffed animal of it. Here you go.
Nostalgia.
Totally. Oh, so good. I know.
Disney.
Disney, man. Disney. So I have another book, although maybe the Sadako and the Paper Cranes, but I'm curious. I'm going to mention it because you might have read it too. And I haven't read it in so long, but I do remember it being very impactful for me. It's a book called Stargirl by Jerry Spinelli. Did you ever read this?
I haven't.
So I'll read the synopsis. It's a celebration of nonconformity, a tense, emotional tale about the fleeting, cruel nature of popularity and the thrill and inspiration of first love. Leo Borlaug follows the unspoken rule at Micah Area High School: don't stand out under any circumstances. Then Stargirl arrives at Micah High and everything changes for Leo and the entire school. After 15 years of homeschooling, Stargirl bursts into the 10th grade in an explosion of color and a clatter of ukulele music enchanting the Micah student body. But the delicate scales of popularity suddenly shift, and Stargirl is shunned for everything that makes her different. Somewhere in the midst of Stargirl's arrival and rise and fall, normal Leo Borlock has tumbled into love with her. In a celebration of nonconformity, Jerry Spinelli weaves a tense emotional tale about the fleeting, cruel nature of popularity and the thrill and inspiration of true love. And it's first love. And it's a book that's really kind of about bullying and like the way that like if you let it, like society will try to diminish you, but without feeling like an issues book, or at least I don't remember it feeling that way. Cause there are books like that where it's like bullying is bad and we'll show you why. And I think those books are important and probably valuable exercises in empathy. But this one, I just remember feeling so, again, alive and so devastated by the ending, which I won't spoil for anyone, even though this book is, middle grade YA and has been out for like 20 years. But like, there's just this, it was just something that felt so real, maybe because at the time I was reading it, it was very real concerns about like, how do you fit in and make friends at a time when most people are trying not to rock the boat while also not losing your authentic self. And there was something so, deep and real and difficult about that, and the book kind of does not pull any punches with it. It was beautiful.
So once I looked it up, I was like, oh, the cover. I was like, oh, I did read this. Like, I don't remember enough of it, but like, I definitely had this book on my bookshelf. So
it was everywhere for a hot minute.
I remember, but when I saw the cover, I was like, oh my gosh, it's from 2000. So.
24 years ago, which that's frightening.
No, let's not. Maybe we'll just not dwell on that.
To the side, that one goes away.
No, I love that though, and I feel like because that experience gets so strong, it's so potent when you're a teen. That's why it fits really well there. But then when I'm still thinking about it, it's still, even in adulthood, you're trying not to rock the boat, but also be yourself. So
totally,
it's timeless.
Totally, it really is, right? It's not like we fix it when you get into adulthood. I have a friend who has a theory, and I personally believe it, that like most of your adulthood is just spent trying to get back to who you were when you were like 10 years old. That like you're just trying to like, who was that authentic self that I like shoved away,
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. That was like false selves was like our first year of therapy. It was like, oh.
Totally.
Oh.
What have I constructed? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, speaking of therapy, my last one is Since She's Been Gone by Sagi Schwartz. So losing her mother to a hit and run at age 15 threw Beatrice Beans Bennett's life into turmoil. Bereft, she developed a life-threatening eating disorder and went through a challenging recovery process, which paved the way for her work. I have hiccups.
Oh no!
As a clinical psychologist decades later, when a new patient arrives at her office and insists that Bean's mother is still alive and in danger, Beans is forced to revisit her past in order to uncover the truth. She learns the patient is a member of a notorious family that owns a drug company largely responsible for the national opioid epidemic, and that her mother was once tangled in their web. In a race against time and her mother's assailants, while once again facing the disorder she thought she put behind her, Beans discovers that, like herself, her mother had a devastating secret.
Fascinating.
So much going on with this one.
Yeah.
She, like, in the past year, even, like, you go to, like, a treatment facility, like, she goes to a treatment facility and a long time of it is spent there. And the amount of pain you feel with the girls, like, the characters she even writes in the treatment facility, like, you just feel how much they want to be skinny, like super skinny. You just feel how badly they want it. And there are even a couple examples of like things that they would do to like be able to not eat, like sneak around. Some of them are devastating. Like there's one that's just still stuck in my mind. So a lot of empathy for people who struggle with eating disorders, how they see themselves. You really live that experience. And the author is a therapist who has helped girls through that. So it's just so emotional, but it's also this thriller. Like the present is the thriller, and then the past is like learning about her eating disorder as a kid. So it's really cool.
And taking down the, like, it sounds like a surrogate for the Sacklers, that family that's like, yeah.
Yes.
That sounds great.
She's so cool too. She's awesome.
Amazing. All right, I got to read that one. Putting it on my to-read list.
Yeah. It's awesome.
That's
so many empathetic books, or
I know.
Inducing.
I know. And like a whole list of things I'm sure we could keep talking about, but also like to some degree, I think almost all fiction, as we kind of said, like just the idea of putting yourself in somebody else's perspective and shoes has like, I think, emotional benefits.
It does.
Yeah.
I agree.